Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at Deutschland's finest and reviewing Germany's top tier lineups in the game of War Thunder. Of course, here's just a quick reminder of the grading scale, with S being the best in category, A being very good, B being average, C being poor, and F being no suitable vehicles. If you want a more complete rundown of those categories, I would recommend watching the first video in the series where I reviewed France, because I go over a lot more in detail how I'm grading these vehicles back then. We will also be going through the vehicle types in descending order from the most important vehicle types to have in a top tier lineup to the least important. As is the tradition with this series, we're going to be looking at the MBT lineup first. Germany has several options for top tier MBTs. The 2A7V is obviously the one that most people focus on. However, vehicles like the Leopard 2A6, the Leopard 2A5, the PSO, etc. are all perfectly usable vehicles. The main advantages and disadvantages of these tanks are fairly stable among the entire Leopard 2 family, so let's briefly go over them. All of these vehicles feature punchy guns, a nice beefy 1500 horsepower engine for some pretty solid mobility, and some pretty bouncy armor and a decent internal layout. While you might be thinking to yourself, that seems like that's basically everything, there are two notable downsides to the Leopard 2 family at top tier. The first one is fairly limited ammo capacity, and the second one is a fairly weak gun arc. Going more in depth into the advantages, all of the German Leopard 2s at top tier feature DM53, and even on the weaker L44 guns, this still pens around 620mm of armor, so it's still an incredibly capable round. However, on the L55s, this is one of the most powerful guns you can get at top tier, and with a 6-second ace reload, it's not exactly slow on the draw either. While you do get a fairly beefy 1500 horsepower engine, the 2A5 and 2A6 are just shy of 60 tons, with the Leopard 2A7V peaking at around 65. This gives the vehicles a fairly good but not exactly impressive power to weight ratio, but generally speaking, mobility will not exactly be a downside. The upper front plate of these tanks can be pretty bouncy, the turret face is generally impenetrable, although areas around the breech can generally be penned, and more importantly, unlike vehicles like the Abrams, they don't tend to lose basically every system with every penetrating hit, so they can sometimes absorb shots. At a glance, this obviously seems like the trifecta of armor, firepower, and mobility, but let's go into the downsides. The ammo capacity is actually a pretty noticeable one. You can only carry 15 rounds in the turret bustle, meaning if you go above 16 rounds, 15 in the bustle and 1 in the chamber, you will now start putting them in the front of the hull, and this makes the vehicle excessively weak to ammo detonations, which means you basically can't ever carry more than 16 rounds. This is fine in most instances, but if you are on a pretty long range map where you can't easily access a cap, it is pretty easy to run out of ammo. Additionally, the selection of utility ammo for the Leopard is fairly weak. While it does have DM53, which is a powerful APF SDS, the high explosive and heat rounds are underwhelming to say the least and aren't really that usable in most instances. That being said, it is probably for the best given the fairly weak ammo capacity, but this will leave you taking out basically nothing but DM53 or DM53 plus maybe one other utility round, which can leave the tank feeling a little inflexible if you do see something like a lightly armored anti-air that the M53 isn't exactly good at engaging. On top of that, one of the recent nerfs to the Leopard included limiting its gun depression arc. This effectively means that once you get a little bit past the 90-degree angle on either side, the gun is going to raise rather significantly so that it doesn't hit the engine deck. This is technically a historical addition, but this also means that the Leopard 2s have the biggest blind spot of any top tier MBT. Even the Abrams, that has a fairly large hump over its engine deck, can actually maintain its gun depression for a larger arc, so while it ultimately has to elevate higher, it doesn't have to elevate until it gets much further around on the vehicle. What this essentially means is that if the Leopard 2 gets immobilized, such as having its engine shot out, then it is generally easier to get around to part of the Leopard 2 where it can't return fire than it is on most other tanks, especially if you're on a shorter tank like a Russian MBT. This is effectively the worst gun arc that you can get on a top tier MBT, as most MBTs can shoot over their engine decks, or at least can go back to a much sharper angle so that it's harder to get behind them when you do knock out their engine. With all that being said, however, the disadvantages of the Leopard 2 family are fairly situational, whereas the advantages are fairly universal. That is to say, you're pretty much always going to be getting at least some use out of their advantages, and their disadvantages might not even come up over the course of an average game. With that in mind, I do think it is pretty easy to give the German MBT lineup a very solid A grade. These tanks perform very well in the vast majority of situations. They have the mobility to flank, they have the firepower to brawl, and their armor is just good enough to catch poorly aimed shells, which at the end of the day is all you really need for top tier. While some of their disadvantages can be slightly frustrating, it's not really enough to make any of them bad. However, I do think your worst pick in the mainline tech tree would be the Leopard 2 PSO, because it adds a lot of extra weight and doesn't really get anything for that mass, and on the whole does perform worse than the 2A6 and the 2A7V. Next up, we're looking at anti-air, and the only real option Germany has for top tier right now is the Florakrad. The advantages of the Florakrad is that it features the fairly long range and reasonably effective VT-1 missiles in addition to smoke grenades and good forward mobility. The disadvantages are that its radar is less than optimal and its main launcher only features 2 ready-to-fire rounds. Now, for anybody who's not terribly familiar with top tier, it may feel a little unusual for me to mention the fact that it has smoke grenades and good forward acceleration as notable advantages, but it actually kind of is, because it turns out a lot of the top tier weapons are increasingly creeping into fire and forget territory, and even those that aren't fire and forget are missiles that behave like things like the Hellfire that can't reliably hit a target through smoke. So the ability to pop smoke and accelerate out of the way of incoming missiles can actually be fairly handy in keeping a Florakrad alive even when it's not doing that much, so you're constantly presenting this target that the enemy has to deal with. On top of the fact that your radar can reliably lock and engage targets through smoke, which I have done multiple times and is pretty effective. On the whole, this is a pretty good advantage, although it is still a niche advantage. It's ultimately only after the enemy is firing missiles at you does this come into play. That being said, the VT-1 missiles are about as good as most nations get at top tier, with only Russia really having a better missile, so it is still a fairly solid option for taking down planes and helicopters. With all that being said, the disadvantages are somewhat notable. The radar on the Florakrad is pretty unimpressive for a top tier radar. It does have a limited ability to discriminate between things like chaff and incoming planes, so it's not going to be fooled all the time, but it is definitely a lot less consistent than some contemporary radars. The bigger issue though is that the launcher only contains 2 missiles and it has to reload, and the reload is fairly lengthy, so this does leave you in a lot of awkward scenarios where if the enemy is firing a salvo of 6 missiles, you basically have to pick and choose which ones you want to intercept. You can use the smoke grenades so that you don't have to intercept any coming towards you, but then it's a question of which teammates do you want to try and save. When trying to grade the Florakrad, it's actually kind of awkward because it turns out I really like the Florakrad, but part of the reason I really like the Florakrad is probably because I got to it after it received 2 pretty noticeable buffs. The first buff was they completely removed the Roland 3 missile, so now you just start with VT-1, which is way better. The second buff was actually the ammo boxes that were added to all anti-airs. Certainly the ammo box helps out everybody, but when you only have a launcher of 2 missiles and the ammo box can refill ammo straight into the launcher, it is actually really good for the Florakrad, because it means if you shoot down a plane or helicopter and you still have 1 missile left in the tube, you don't have to choose between either wasting a missile or just trying to start the next fight with only 1 missile. That being said, as much as I liked it, I can't deny that it does have some pretty harsh limitations, so I am stuck giving it a simple B grade. It is a pretty functional anti-air. The enemy has to respect the VT-1 missile because it can certainly hit them from pretty long ranges pretty reliably if they're not paying attention. However, it's not an exceptional anti-air, and it will struggle, especially with some of the stronger planes and helicopters. Next up, we're going to be grading the light tanks, and because there are several different options and none of them are just standout obviously best options, I am going to kind of go through them one by one and look at some of their pros and cons. The first one and the most obvious one most people look at is the Puma VJTF. The Puma VJTF has a slow firing but pretty effective autocannon compared with Spike fire and forget missiles. It can be a reasonably effective vehicle, especially in terms of tanking shots. However, its damage model basically leads to it getting crippled every time it's hit by essentially anything. A hit to the Spike missiles in particular will knock out your tracks for some baffling reason, so the VJTF can be a bit of a repair simulator. The biggest issue with the VJTF though is that it doesn't really offer a lot of meaningful advantages in terms of mobility versus the Leopard 2s that you're going to have in your lineup, so it ends up doing a lot of the same jobs as your Leopard 2s. It just does those jobs in a slightly different way, so it's not adding the most to your lineup. The second major option is the Radkampfwagen 90, and the problem with the Rad really comes down to, while it does have exceptionally good wheeled mobility and it is very agile, it has a pretty long reload, a pretty weak shell, and no thermals. And this is a bit awkward because normally if you had a long reload and a weak shell, you would seek to engage at longer ranges on flanks, but the lack of thermals means you're going to have difficulty spotting enemies before they spot you. But lack of thermals usually means you want to play at close ranges, but at close ranges it can kind of struggle due to the weak shell and long reload. So while you can have good games in the RAD and the exceptional mobility do allow it to be pretty effective in certain situations, it's not consistently effective. Another vehicle that's worth considering is the Begleitpanzer 57, and the problem with the Begleitpanzer really boils down to it doesn't really have any major mobility over an MBT, it's also not that survivable, and its missiles are borderline useless at this battle rating. That being said, if you can execute a flank, the autocannon on it will actually chew through most MBTs even more efficiently than contemporary autocannons at top tier, so it can be really effective if you get that flank off, but it doesn't exactly have the toolset to reliably get that flank off. On the whole, I would say the German top tier options for light tanks are a bit of a mixed bag and struggle to provide things that are dramatically different from what your MBTs are doing while also being very competent vehicles in their own right, so I think a B grade is a pretty fair assessment. However, this is a B grade with an asterisk because there is one somewhat awkward aspect of this that we have to discuss, and this is the Boxers. Remember how I said with the Puma and the Begleitpanzer that the biggest issue was that they don't really offer anything meaningful over your MBTs, they just do a lot of the same things but slightly differently? Well, the Boxers are both wheeled vehicles that have pretty good forward mobility, and they have different weapon sets. The Boxer MGS has a 105mm auto-loaded cannon that is more powerful and faster firing than the RAD and also has good thermals, and the Vilkas has essentially the same weapon combination as the Puma. It's not quite as good, but does a very similar job in most situations. So these are two fast wheeled vehicles that you can slot into your lineup that actually do offer some meaningful advantages over your MBTs in a lot of situations. So if you do have the Boxers, this tentatively upgrades to an A grade, and this isn't saying the Boxers are anything exceptional by any means. They're probably B grade vehicles in my opinion. They're not bad, they're not great, but it turns out they do offer a lot to a lineup when the rest of your lineup are things like the Leo 2A6 and the Leo 2A7V. So this is one of those weird scenarios where having access to some previous event vehicles that are currently kind of difficult to obtain will give you access to what, in my opinion, is a slightly better lineup. Next up, we have the helicopters, and the only real helicopter option for Germany at top tier is the Tiger UHT. You can use the premium Tiger HOD E. It's not terrible, but it would be basically a C grade if you're choosing to use it. I would definitely recommend the UHT. As far as advantages, the Tiger UHT has a full complement of fire and forget missiles, and as far as disadvantages, it has no gun and it has a fairly limited inventory of missiles. Now the UHT comes with the PARS missiles and the Mistral missiles, and the PARS missiles were actually the first fire and forget anti-tank missile ever added to the Game of War Thunder. The Tiger UHT is actually a somewhat old vehicle in that respect. However, I will say the PARS are noticeably faster and thus a little bit more reliable than the newer Spike missiles that have been added to the game, even though their performance when hitting a target tends to be basically the same. The disadvantages for the Tiger UHT are actually pretty noticeable. The first one is a fairly limited inventory of missiles. You only get 8 PARS and 4 Mistrals, and given how inconsistent they can be in terms of damage and in terms of the Mistrals actually hitting enemies, this is probably not enough to stay out for too long on your own, which means you're going to be tethered to an airfield, which can be fairly awkward and makes you pretty predictable for things like planes to find. The second disadvantage of not having a gun just capitalizes on that, because not having a gun makes you fairly weak to a lot of the planes that people are going to spawn around this battle rating. The Mistrals can struggle to hit these high performance fighters, even if the high performance fighters aren't particularly trying to dodge. If they're just flying in a straight line fairly quickly, the Mistrals can sometimes struggle to track them. So having the 30mm cannon on things like the French Tiger HOD Block 2 is a big benefit, because it does mean you can quote-unquote bullfight them and try to move to the side whilst hitting them with your cannon and hope that that's enough. In many cases you can win, but a lot of times even if you lose those bullfights, you can still take the plane down with you, whereas the Tiger UHT can't really do that and ends up being largely helpless against these newer jets. Interestingly enough, while the Tiger UHT's contemporary, the Ka-52, has already appeared on this channel and I gave it fairly high marks because it is such a versatile airframe, the Tiger UHT hasn't really aged as well as the Ka-52. As more and more fire and forget missiles get added, it's not as impressive to simply have them on your helicopter, and additionally as more aircraft with fire and forget missiles also get guns, and also more planes get added that aren't really that vulnerable to things like the Mistral, the Tiger UHT does drop a little bit down in terms of the pecking order. That being said, I don't think I could ever realistically drop the Tiger UHT below a B grade. It is a very functional helicopter, the PARS missiles are still good after all these years, and they feel pretty solid to use even compared to the newer Spikes. but it does have a pretty glaring vulnerability that canny opponents will be sure to exploit. Next up for Germany, we have the Jets, and this is one of those categories that I was definitely not looking forward to right up until the Storm Warning upgrade was released and they added the Eurofighter Typhoon. Before that, it would have either been the F4S Ice or the Tornado, and neither of those would have been particularly fun to play or get footage for, as both of them are pretty suboptimal. But today we are reviewing the Typhoon, and it is definitely what I would recommend as your cast option for fixed-wing aircraft at top tier. The advantages of the Typhoon are that it has excellent flight performance, good weapons, and a large inventory of weapons, whereas the number one disadvantage is that it actually has fairly slow air-to-ground weapons. In terms of air-to-air right now, the Typhoon can currently carry AIM-120Bs and AIM-9Ms that can carry that alongside even some of its most powerful air-to-ground loadouts, and combined with the fact that the Typhoon has arguably the best flight performance of any top-tier aircraft right now, you really don't have to be afraid of anything in the skies. The Typhoon can reliably clear the entire air of enemies. Combine that with the fact that even some of the lighter payloads that it can carry for both air-to-air and air-to-ground mixed have it carrying something on the order of around 6 to 8 air-to-air missiles and around 12 to 18 air-to-ground missiles, and the Typhoon has a very high loiter time and can have a huge impact in the skies. The biggest drawback, however, is that the Typhoon does in fact have some pretty slow air-to-ground munitions. It does have things like laser-guided bombs or unguided weapons if you really want those. However, I imagine most players are going to gravitate towards the Brimstones. The Brimstone's biggest issue is that they are laser-guided missiles and they are natively pretty slow. If you launch them at high speeds, the Brimstones will start at a pretty high speed, but ultimately they do slow down, and especially if you try to launch them at longer distances, it can take upwards of a minute to hit targets that are 10 kilometers away. This is a bit of an issue given how fast most ground games tend to resolve. Within the first 2 to 3 minutes, you typically already know who's going to win, and this is why a lot of aircraft with things like fire and forget missiles such as KH-38s, Mavericks, or Hammers can have a huge impact right away and potentially do enough to actually swing the results of a battle. The Typhoon really struggles to do that. Sure, it has a lot of Brimstones and it can kill targets with Brimstones, that's not the issue. The issue is that the flight time of the Brimstones combined with the amount of time it takes to set up attack runs, laze targets, keep the target lazed until the Brimstone impacts, set up a new attack run, etc, etc. You're just looking at a fairly awkward and lengthy window in which it takes before the Typhoon can actually start having an impact on the ground battlefield and helping its teammates. On the whole, I would say these factors balance out into the Typhoon being essentially a B-grade cast option. While it can be really powerful in the air-to-air role and keeping enemy air at bay, what you really want to do in a cast plane, especially at this point in top tier, is you want to have that immediate impact where you're helping your team win basically right now, and the Typhoon simply can't do that. It can support the team, it can certainly help the team to an extent, but having that big immediate flashy impact, the Typhoon is just not really capable of doing it at this point in the game. It's certainly possible that at one point the guidance of the Brimstones do get an update that allows them to have this more flashy and immediate impact on the battlefield, but we don't know when or if that'll happen. This also brings up an interesting caveat. The few games you have where the game actually goes long and it's still undecided at around the 5 to 10 minute mark, the Typhoons can be very impactful aircraft, and a big part of this is their loiter time. I personally started running the loadout with maximizing the AMRAAMs and only taking a mere 12 Brimstones, which was still more than enough in most instances, and this allowed me to stay up in the air for 5 to 10 minutes at a time, constantly taking out enemy planes and ground targets, and if you do get a longer match, this can be enough to push your team over the top and win the match for you. The biggest problem with this is that, well, right now the games just aren't going the distance. They aren't going long enough for you to really see this kind of impact. So if the meta top tier does change and it does slow down a bit in terms of how long it takes a match to play out, I could definitely see the Typhoons getting more powerful, but for the time being, it's just a solid option and really nothing else. And last and generally least, we have the tank destroyer category, and the only real option for Germany in terms of tank destroyers at top tier is this cute little guy, the Wiesel 1A2. The advantages of the Wiesel 1A2 are that it's small, it's fast, and it can scout, whereas the disadvantages are that it has fairly inconsistent missiles and a long reload. As far as advantages, the Wiesel 1A2 does have a unique advantage in that it is one of the few missile destroyers that can scout enemies, so it can act as basically a secondary light tank but has a much lower spawn cost than a normal light tank. It's also quick to accelerate and fairly tiny, even though its top speed isn't that much better than most other tanks at its battle rating, but this does mean that it can get into positions very quickly and and it can also get into and use parts of the map that most other vehicles simply can't. This gives the VZL some advantages if you want to simply troll the enemy, but it also gives the VZL some advantages if you want to sneak up on or try to get the jump on enemies that otherwise would be more than a match for you. Of course, the biggest problem with the VZL is really just the missiles. I tried using the TOW2Bs a fair bit to try and see if I could make them work. The problem is a lot of Russian tanks around this battle rating actually have ERA on their roofs, and all of the Leopards essentially have SPAL liners on their roofs even if they don't have SPAL liners everywhere else. This made the TOW2Bs far too inconsistent to really be used consistently at a 12.7 match. I did end up favoring the TOW2As, and the TOW2As with their tandem warhead and good penetration worked perfectly fine, although they still had some inconsistencies. The other big issue is that you only have one missile ready to fire, and the reload is awkwardly long. So if that one missile catches ERA bad or just doesn't do any meaningful damage, you're basically dead. This is the real crux of the VZL-1A2, is just its weapons. If you just replace the missile launcher with the 4 rack of missiles you have on something like the AFTI, this would be a near perfect tank destroyer, and it's only really the missiles that hold it back. With that being said, however, I don't think the quality of the missiles is anywhere near poor enough to hold the VZL back from anything but an A grade. The high mobility is excellent, but what really pushes it into A for me is the active scouting, so that you can be small and annoying, but you can also scout things for your team and take shots of opportunity as you see them. This allows the VZL to fill a lot of roles that you can't generally fill with other vehicles of your battle rating, and as the main job of a tank destroyer is to get you spawn points for a very low cost, the VZL fills this niche perfectly. I don't think it's quite on par with the Chinese AFTI, but it is still a pretty solid vehicle and worth consideration in your top tier lineup, unlike most other tank destroyers in the game. As is the tradition, this is where I'm going to give you some of my overall thoughts on the German top tier before I give you what, in my opinion, is their overall grade. At the bottom, you will see my preferred lineup, and this also brings us to one of the more awkward points of discussion with German top tier, and that is the presence of the Boxers. I don't generally like recommending a lineup that is either consisting of older event vehicles that players can't generally get a hold of, or alternatively is consisting of premium vehicles that you can only ever buy, because that makes it less free-to-play friendly. But in this instance, the Boxers do offer something that the rest of the German lineup, at least currently, doesn't. That being said, the Boxers are a fairly large family of vehicles in real life, so it's not unlikely that we'll see some of them in the mainline tech tree at some point that may replace some of these roles. If you don't have the Boxers, the German tech tree lights can fill the jobs at least to some extent, although you will be a little lacking. The VZL-1A2 is certainly a viable choice, as is the Puma VJTF, and you can even try to use the Rad Kampfwagen, although you might run into some issues with that. Since we're on the topic of more free-to-play friendly aspects of this lineup, I would also like to offer the viewers some food for thought. While the Leopard 2A7V is what most people are going to go for, my record with the 2A7V and my record with the 2A6 were very similar, to the point where they were almost indistinguishable. And part of the reason is that the advantage of the 2A7V is that it's generally better at getting hit. It has a better UFP armor, it has a SPAL liner, etc. Whereas the 2A6 in all other instances is going to be just as good, if not slightly better, due to it being about 4 tons lighter. In this instance, any time that you're not getting hit, you might as well be in a Leopard 2A6, and the 2A5 isn't noticeably worse than the 2A6 in most areas. On top of that, I do consider the Leopard 2 PSO to be largely a waste of time. It is incredibly heavy, and I never really found the extra armor doing anything for the tank's survivability, on top of the fact that it has the older L44 gun, so it doesn't even have the best gun. So to replicate this lineup, you would have to research the Leo 2A5, then you would have to go for the foldered and optional 2A6 and use that in your lineup, then you would have to go through the PSO, which you're not going to use, and then you would have to go through this 2A7V. That is a lot of silver and a lot of RP for a free-to-play player to grind, and I'm gonna be honest, the 2A5 and the 2A6 together as a lineup will work just as well in a lot of situations. I feel like it's very easy to get caught in the trap of trying to go for whatever is highest in the tree and thinking that is the best, but I'm going to be honest, the 2A5 and the 2A6 still very much clap and can absolutely win you games. So it is at least worth considering if you're maybe strapped for credits, or you just don't feel like grinding out the extra 800,000 RP to go through the PSO and the 2A7V. Reflecting on all the individual aspects of the German lineup, not just the aspects individually, but also how they work together as a cohesive whole, I think I'm going to give Germany basically an A grade. I feel like the German lineup works incredibly well together, the MBTs are very competent, and the support elements for them are generally good enough. And And really, that's all you need your support elements to be. You don't need them to be the best. You don't need the best anti-air, the best light tank, the best air. You just need them to complete the package around your MBTs, because 9 times out of 10 right now, what's winning a top tier match is your MBT lineup, and Germany arguably has one of the best. Of course, those are just my opinions on the matter. Feel free to let me know in the comments down below what you think of the Germany top tier. If you liked the video, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. And also, as a brief note about these top tier review series, as you can probably tell by all the information I put out, I actually spend a lot of time on individual vehicles, both trying to spade them, understand where they work in the lineup, and how well different options work compared to one another. And that's part of the reason why these take so long. I've gotten a lot of requests for these, and I certainly understand that, but I also don't want to compromise the overall quality. I want to have a firm understanding of all of the vehicles before I actually jump into one of these reviews, so I can give you a more accurate idea of where I think they honestly sit. That concludes this video. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.